So there's an image from Walter's family lore of my great-grandmother Sanders, whom I never actually met. She's on the phone when children burst into the house after school, and she clasps the receiver to her chest and shushes the youngsters severely in Pennsylvania Dutch. But the reason she needs the house quiet is not so she can continue her conversation in peace. It's so that her covert surveillance operation will not be exposed. You see, in the 1940s, the Walters house had a party line, which meant, if you've never heard of such a thing, that a single phone line was shared by several neighbors. So, if Grandma Sanders lifted the receiver very quietly while her friend Mabel across the street was on a call, she could listen in and get all kinds of great information. I guess a more charitable description than surveillance would be to say Grandma was just listening to the local news. But that image may be why something I read many years later in seminary by a New Testament scholar named Richard Hayes has stuck with me for a long, long time. He wrote, "When we read the letters of Paul, we repeatedly encounter the tantalizing challenge of the unspoken, just as though we were listening to one end of a telephone conversation." Has it ever occurred to you that the Bible actually wasn't written to you? That when we read, actually not only Paul's epistles, but anything in the Bible, we're kind of listening in on somebody else's conversation. Don't get me wrong. I believe Holy Scripture is alive and inspired by God to challenge and change us and draw us into the life of God's good kingdom, which Jesus says can spring into view here and now if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. But part of the work of seeing and hearing Scripture has always been to ask, but who is talking to whom here? I mean, if you're listening in on a phone conversation, you can get things pretty tangled up if you don't understand the context, right? Well, this sermon actually is not on Paul's thoughts on resurrection in 1 Corinthians. It's on the Beatitudes in Luke. That strange list of blessedness, shorter than Matthew's version, but which includes those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who weep, those who are hated. Things are turning around for you, Jesus says to all these people. But woe to the rich, the full, the laughing, and the well-spoken of. Things are turning around for you too, but that probably doesn't sound so great when the status quo is working out just fine. Luke is also the gospel, you remember, that begins with the birth narrative. Do you remember what Mary says when she goes to tell her cousin Elizabeth the good news of her pregnancy? "All generations will call me blessed," she sings. "He's brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He's filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich empty away." Mary is experiencing beatitude before Jesus is even born. And her Magnificat introduces this recurring theme about the upside-down priorities of God, the reversals, the inversions of the way things are that take place when God's priorities, not the priorities of the powers that be, become real. I've been preaching on these stories for almost 20 years now, and I've lived with them all my life. So there's kind of a default position in me that I'm just the sort of person Jesus had in mind when he taught. So I can cozy up next to him when I hear his words, and we can look out on the rest of the world from here. But the truth is, by any objective standards, I'm not terribly lowly or hungry or poor. Which means neither Mary nor Jesus were speaking to the likes of me. Not directly, at least. A middle-class Episcopal priest with a healthy parish and a decent salary and a house in a comfortable neighborhood can only really listen in on this conversation and then maybe wonder if there are parts of it he'll never understand. Maybe wonder what goes unspoken among people in a time and a place and a situation that's very different from his own. Maybe even wonder what to do with Jesus when he does seem to turn around and say to me, "Woe to you, rich, full, laughing, well-thought-of Reverend Scott Walters. The question must be asked, is there any good news at all in this conversation for somebody like me? Is there any good news in it for you? Spoiler alert, I do still think there's good news here, even for me. But I no longer believe I can hear the gospel for what it is until I reckon with the fact that I'm listening in on a story that's mostly being told to somebody else. Howard Thurman put it this way near the beginning of Jesus and the Disinherited. Many and varied interpretations dealing with the teachings and the life of Jesus of Nazareth, but few of these interpretations deal with what the teachings and life of Jesus have to say to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall. Well, the people crowded around Jesus that day on the plain clearly had their backs against the wall, did they not? They'd come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, we're told. Those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured, and all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power went out of him and healed all of them. These are folks who are sick and possessed by terrible forces beyond their control. They pressed in upon him in hopes that just the touch of a garment hem might finally make them well. Lately, Nathan Brassfield and some others deeply involved in our community ministries at Calvary have been talking about priorities and logistics and even our place among the network of organizations working on poverty in Memphis. And what struck me looking in is how the people doing this discernment aren't wondering what might be good for some generic, hypothetical person who is, to use Jesus' words in Luke, poor or hungry or weeping or hated. They're actually talking about people they know by name quite often, whose stories they know fairly well sometimes. People they've seen through better days and not such good ones. And each Sunday, a volunteer walks around taking prayer requests from the folks lined up for breakfast. And turns out, if you ask somebody who may have slept outside last night what they could use a prayer for, they'll say they want their child to be safe, or they want their friend to stay off drugs, or to find a house to stay in a safe neighborhood. Or they'll say they just want to say thanks to God for waking them up into another day. Or thanks for the people who got up to serve coffee. Or just ordinary human prayers, in other words. The stuff of life people from all walks of life pray for, worry about. Which is why, even though I really do believe meaningful needs are being met each Sunday, I've come to see the essence of this ministry as a matter of friendship, presence. A moment in which people from very different lives actually see each other. Howard Thurman also wrote this: the first step toward love is a common sharing of a sense of mutual worth and value. This cannot be discovered in a vacuum or in a series of artificial or hypothetical relationships. It has to be in a real situation, natural, free. I'm not saying that's always what happens here, but it happens here. And even though it's true that all people have places within themselves that are poor and hungry and sad, I guess today I just want to honor that Jesus was speaking particularly to people who've known physical poverty and hunger and so much more in ways that I just haven't. These were the people Jesus sought out. These were the people he shared meals with and made his friends. The people whom he insisted lived, like Mary, firmly within the upside-down blessedness of God. And more than once, he told a rich person like me that I was probably going to have a hard time entering this kingdom at all because I've got so much to walk away from before I can feel at home in a place where I'm loved, not because of anything I've earned or accomplished or owned, but simply because love is who God is. Jesus loved and sought out people at the margins, foreigners and sinners, the unclean and the poor, women, heretics, more in his culture. He sought them out because he wanted them to see that they were beloved and blessed by God. Full stop. To those with more power and security and privilege, I think he does let us overhear him. And his grace, even overheard, is sufficient, I believe. Maybe you've listened in on a life or stumbled into one time that broke you out of that performance of blessedness by the standards of this world and exposed you to that blessedness that can never be earned, maybe which you couldn't have imagined for yourself. I'll leave you with one last story. At the height of his career as a teacher and a writer and a priest, Henry Nouwen looks for all the world like a success. He was saving other lives through what he wrote and taught, but dying inside when he went to live at a L'Arche community for developmentally disabled adults. And here's what he said happened to him. The first thing that struck me when I came to live in a house with mentally handicapped people was that their liking or disliking me had absolutely nothing to do with any of the many useful things I'd done up till then. Since nobody could read my books, they could not impress anyone. Since most of them never went to school, my 20 years at Notre Dame, Yale, and Harvard did not provide a significant introduction. My considerable ecumenical experience proved even less valuable. When I offered some meat to one of the assistants during dinner, one of the handicapped men said to me, "Don't give him meat. He doesn't eat meat. He's a Presbyterian." These broken, wounded, and completely unpretentious people, Nouwen wrote, forced me to let go of my relevant self, the self that can do things, show things, prove things, build things, and forced me to reclaim that unadorned self in which I'm completely vulnerable, open to receive and give love, regardless of any of my accomplishments. L'Arche, you see, wasn't made for the Henry Nouwens of this world. But looking in on life in that place was the only way he could begin to see that God's love might play by a different set of rules, and that there were places in himself it would never reach as long as his successes and accomplishments blocked the way. If you're poor, hungry, weeping, or hated right now, Jesus is seeking you out to tell you that you're blessed and beloved by God. You're the one he's looking for. You're the one his message is meant for. And if you find yourself in a place of a little more privilege and power, as I so often do myself, well, he will let us listen in on what he has to say to God's blessed and beloved ones. He may glance over to remind us that wealth and success and a good name in this world can still obscure a love that cares nothing for any of that at all. But he'll do so only to get through to that unadorned, vulnerable self in each one of us that is open to receive such love, and open then, I believe, to give such love away.